welcome to Contact. I'm your host, Craig Delahunt, and on today's show we'll be talking with Thom Henley. Thank you very much for joining us, Thom.
Thank you, Craig.
Thom has lived with indigenous people around the world. He's authored and co-authored several books. He's received 6 national and international awards for conservationism. More recently, he's just returned from a around-the-world tour with the Penan People. Would you like to tell us about the tour, Thom?
Well, it was a whirlwind, and I'm still sort of recuperating from it. We did 16 countries and 28 cities in only 55 days. And the purpose of the tour was to give the Penan people a direct voice to the world. This was the first time in history that Penan people had ever left their home island of Borneo.
Which is?
It's the 3rd largest island in the world. It straddles the equator, and politically it's actually divided in between 3 countries. The state of Kalimantan, which is part of Indonesia, makes up most of the island. And then there's 2 states of East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, in the northern part that straddle an independent country, Brunei, which is one of the smallest but wealthiest countries in the world.
How have they come to be in this strait or dire strait? Hasn't this sort of situation been happening for a long time? Or?
The world's attention hasn't really been focused very much on Southeast Asia. You know, like a lot of North Americans have been concerned with Central and South American rainforest. Europeans have been focused on Africa, but Southeast Asia has been largely ignored until the last couple of years. And Japanese social shogus, these huge trading companies, have been moving throughout this area, first the Philippines, then Sabah, and now into Sarawak. And they're logging at a rate there that surpasses anything the world has ever known. So basically in the last decade, more than half of the Sarawak rainforests have disappeared, and the other half are scheduled to go within the next 3 to 6 years. The most optimistic forecast is maybe 10 or 11 years.
What's the lumber being used for? Building?
This is one of the real tragedies here, is that most of the lumber is being squandered. More than half of it goes directly to Japan, and most of that is used to make concrete construction forms for pouring concrete to make high-rise buildings. It's used 1.4 times on the average, discarded and burnt, because it's actually cheaper to bring in Malaysian timber to Japan than it is to use reusable steel forms for construction because of the storage problems they have in Japan.
What sort of people are the Penan? Are they? I mean, a lot of the indigenous natives there were headhunters. Do they differ from?
Yeah, the Penan are about the most fascinating people I've met anywhere in the world, and they're one of many, about 32 different tribal groups in Sarawak alone, and all of these other tribal groups were agriculturally based. They would clear sections of rainforest, grow rice, also depend on fish and some game from the forest. But the Penan are the last intact nomadic hunting-gathering culture left in Southeast Asia. They never practiced headhunting, as all of their tribal neighbors did, and very shy, gentle people. In fact, they don't even have a word in their language for warfare. And like nomadic hunting-gathering cultures throughout the world, everything they have is instantly and completely shared with all members of the band. So they have some very special qualities that you don't see in many places left in the world. There's the Mabuti people in the Zaire River Basin in Africa, there's the Maku in the Amazon, but really you can count the number of nomadic hunting-gathering cultures left on Earth on one hand. There's very few people left.
What actually precipitated the tour? I think it was a surprise to a lot of people, including yourself.
I had made 6 trips into Borneo starting in April of 1989, and the Penan were really appealing to the world for some direct intervention. There had been local conservation efforts there trying to resolve this issue through the courts, trying to get information out to the public, but for 5 years the Penan and other tribal peoples of Sarawak had blockaded logging roads peacefully, trying to get a resolution of this outstanding grievance that, you know, they wanted to protect some part of their homeland. And they were just going through this mill, this revolving door of being arrested, going to jail, going through the courts and being released, and the logging continued. In fact, it was intensifying to 24 hours a day. So in complete desperation, they were seeking out any foreigners they could find, even the average tourist passing through their area. They were begging them, beseeching them to please do something on their behalf. And the idea of a tour, I think, is not a new idea. There was certainly the Sting Tour, and David Suzuki here in Canada took Payakon around the world, and that proved very successful. So this was mentioned to them as a possibility, and never before in history, though, had a Penan person ever received a passport, so this was the first challenge. And Canada actually played a major role in this because it was a Canadian church organization that invited a delegation of Christian Penan to come to an ecumenical church conference in North America. And it was by focusing on the religious rights question, I think, when this thing went before the passport authorities, rather than the political aspect of the fact that Penan might be taking their message to the outside world, that we were successful in securing passports for two Penan to travel.
Was it excuse me? Was it dangerous?
I think there's a level of danger involved there because the the Sarawak state authorities are really restrictive with foreign journalists allowed into the country. 3 or 4 people meeting together there is an illegal assembly. There's a lot of police surveillance, and if you go in there and actually visit a Penan site and take photographs or meet with the people, you can be deported. Your film can be confiscated as well as your camera equipment. So the people in Sarawak certainly don't share the level of freedom that we have here in Canada. And the dangers there are probably perhaps greater, though, for the native peoples than they are for foreigners, because all kinds of political repercussions could be forthcoming to those people for bringing this truthful statement out to the world.
Well, how safe is it for them to return? I imagine they have returned now.
Well, yeah, they have returned, and they've returned safely as far as we know. The last report we got is that they hadn't been harassed since they returned. I think we tried to build a security net for them, and they met with a lot of really high-level politicians and heads of state around the world, and these people all sent letters to the Malaysian government saying how impressed they were by meeting these 3 individuals. They wanted to hear from these 3 individuals again that things were improving in Sarawak. So we tried to build a safety net as they returned, and people around the world are hoping and praying every day that there's been no repercussions.
So you're looking on the tour as being successful, and what do you see really coming out of it?
Well, one thing we did is we greatly expanded the support base for this issue. Up until now, there's been about maybe 70 environmental groups worldwide that have been concerned with the issue. But like I said, the strategies have pretty well been restricted to the court cases and to just public awareness. What the tour did is it broadened the base of support. We brought in major church groups, human rights groups, key politicians and decision makers, and even royalty that had never before really been committed to the issue or even aware of it are now deeply committed. And I think there's some major resolutions now coming forward from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the United Nations Environment Program, a number of strategies that are of such a delicate nature that I can't discuss them publicly right now. But I think Bruno Manser, the Swiss fugitive who had spent 6 years living with the Penan and who's really become a champion of their cause, he told me personally at the end of the tour that prior to the tour he didn't really see a lot of hope, but now he truly believes that this area will be saved. He said, "We haven't seen the fruits of our labor yet, but the flower has been well pollinated."
Could you describe him a little more now?
Bruno?
He's become a hero.
Yeah, well, it'd be very easy for someone to get caught up in their ego in a situation like that, because it was through Bruno's efforts largely that the attention was drawn to the Penan, worldwide attention. And, a lot of the media played up this white Tarzan who had chosen to live with the Penan people. But Bruno is, of all the people I've ever met, he's perhaps the most egoless. He's really become a Penan person in many ways, and it was really a delight to travel with him, and he's just got a real pure heart and a real caring heart for these people, and he wants to see their land protected.
While he was in Sarawak, didn't he have a price on his head?
At one time, I believe there was about a $60,000 price tag on his head, and
Dead or alive?
We don't know exactly. The government of Sarawak and Malaysia denied this, but the Swiss embassy was concerned enough that they sent a delegation there to protest this, because the only law he had ever violated there was to overextend his visa by about 6 years.
Now, when he was on the tour, didn't he have Interpol chasing him?
He had Interpol pursuing him when he first came out of Sarawak last June, May and June, I guess it was, but I believe that's let up, and we didn't have any problems during the tour. He was on the tour as the translator for the Penan, not to put his story out in front of their own, but just to help translate.
Now, he hasn't been able to get back in.
It'd be very difficult for him to go back in. It wouldn't be wise at this point.
Very unsafe.
Yeah. But he realized, that if there was anything further that was going to be done to help save these people in their homeland, that had to be done from outside of Sarawak. He had pretty well done what he could in the country. The government accuses him of instigating the whole thing, saying that, this is really an outside agitator that's come in and made an issue out of a non-issue. But this isn't true. The Penan people and other tribal people of Sarawak were protesting and blockading roads long before Bruno went in there. The role Bruno played was he was almost like a secretary to the outside world, helping them to translate their concerns from Penan language into English or German or French, and getting the information to the outside world.
Amongst many of the countries you visited, you're also in Japan now. I was talking actually with Paul Watson. He once stated Japan as maybe environmentally public enemy #1. Do you think that this tour has made an impression on the Japanese, and do you think something positive will come out of it?
Well, the television coverage surrounding the issue in Japan was completely unprecedented, and the tour resulted in this. You know, like there was a lot of really excellent coverage, and I think that reached a lot of people. When you hold public events in Japan, if you can draw 100 or 120 people, that's a very big event in terms of environmental issues, because the awareness there is just not the same as it is, say, in North America, Australia, or Europe. But I've been to Japan 3 times now on speaking engagements, all 3 times, and I definitely sense a change taking place there. I would agree that Japan's environmental policies are probably by far and away the worst in the world, but to just point fingers of accusation at Japan and be blaming them with this is not very productive. The people get their backs up, they feel it's just Japan bashing, and they can't distinguish between what's legitimate global environmental concern and a lot of other Japan bashing that takes place out there because of the economy. And some of this has racial overtones too, I think.
Did you get a lot of support from other environmental groups?
There was about 70 NGOs worldwide that supported this tour very actively, and quite a number of human rights groups and church groups, and that was it was really exciting and encouraging to see that. I felt the support was overwhelming, and it really surpassed my expectations.
You were also telling me too that you had some opposition from an environmental group in Asia. How did that happen? And I think it was linked with one of our environmental groups here.
Yeah, I think some of it was just based on miscommunication from the start, and it's very difficult for the environmental groups in Asia to be perceived to be supporting something that the Malaysian government and authorities might be very strongly opposed to. So I think for their own protection they had to come out and officially and say they didn't endorse or support the tour. But I think that's understandable.
How did Western Canada Wilderness Committee become involved with an issue that's so far removed from our shores?
When I first returned from Sarawak in April of 1989, I was having meetings with the Wilderness Committee because they had just published the rediscovery book that I had done. And I brought back some images and my concerns about what I had seen there. And they're the type of organization that doesn't sit around and wait for months for the board to make decisions on these things. They're very proactive, and they just jumped on this and got very excited about it and says, yes, we will do something. And literally within a month they had a poster out, a major newspaper out on it, and started making it a Canadian campaign as well.
Now, there's a branch of the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, WILD, which now deals with, I guess, international situations. When did they become? When were they created?
Well, I think it became quite prominent this past June at the WILD conference in Honolulu. It was an international conference bringing together non-governmental organizations from around the world to map out the world's last wild places and try and develop a strategy for protecting them.
So WILD then isn't a branch of Western Canada's Wilderness Committee?
Yes, it is. It's a branch. It's sort of the international branch, international arm of the Wilderness Committee, which is really has its focus in Western Canada and is sort of broadened out to be nationwide now.
Right. Tell us about some of the books. You've actually just written a book which you've collaborated on with Wade Davis, and it's interesting because apparently it's going to be translated into Malaysian.
Yeah, it's called Penan, Voice for the Borneo Rainforest, and it's based on the words of one nomadic Penan hunter, gatherer. And when I first got this video testimonial in April of '89, I was so impressed by the simplicity but eloquence with which this entire position was laid out for the world by this one person that I felt that it actually could stand up as a book. So we very closely wed Dawat Lapung's words with images, color images from Sarawak, and then Professor Dr. Wade Davis assisted me in putting a lot of background information together for people to better understand it. And the Wilderness Committee and the WILD campaign published this book because all of the proceeds from it, plus the royalties, are all going directly to support the Sarawak cause.
Tom, we're going to throw a shock into the director. We're going to take a break here for about 2 minutes and just have a look at one of the scenes from Blowpipes and Bulldozers.
Timber is big business in Sarawak, and nowhere in the world are the forests disappearing so fast. In the last decade, Malaysia has earned over $10 billion from its Sarawak logging operation and is the world's largest exporter of tropical hardwoods. The Penan hear the chainsaws day in and day out and are desperate as they watch their food trees fall. They are already into the heart of the last paradise from two sides, says Bruno. A Penan man related a story of a logging manager He tried to give him a $100 note as compensation for the destruction of the graves of his parents. I told him that, dead or alive, our bodies were not for sale, and pleaded with him that if they had so much money already, to please leave our land alone. But he just laughed and said, "Take this money or you'll get nothing." The Penan have asked the government for help, but have received only empty promises, and now the logging companies even threaten the Penan.
The company, they went to the Penans and told them, "At daylight I work on my tractor, but at night I come to your settlement and I will kill your children."
You've just been watching Blowpipes and Bulldozers. Tom, let's talk about some of the other books. You were also involved in the Moresby Island Park creation.
Well, I collaborated on the book Islands at the Edge, Preserving the Queen Charlotte Islands Wilderness, and Jacques Cousteau did the foreword to that. And along with John Broadhead, a friend of mine, we worked on this book for about 2 years, brought together a number of authors, like Dr. Wayne Campbell at the Royal BC Museum and Dr. Bristol Foster, Bill Reed, and put out a book that actually won the Bookseller's Choice Award for the best published book in BC the year it came out, and is now in its 8th printing. It's done very well. But it really helped to save South Moresby, and there's something to be said for taking an issue like that and putting it into a book format where it really increases the public awareness of an issue.
Can you tell us about some of your conservation awards? Now, they're national and international.
Well, this is just all sort of came about very quickly once South Moresby was resolved. In 1987, we saw the area protected, and a lot of them were national and even some provincial awards, but I received the Sol Finestone Award from the State University of New York, and this was the first time in the history of this award, which goes back many, many years, that it had been given to someone outside of the United States. So we were quite pleased with that. And I don't think the awards are so important, I'll tell you the truth. I would like to see everyone in the world get an environmental award so they can live up to the responsibilities and get on with what needs to be done here.
And yet you don't like to be referred to as an environmentalist.
No, I don't, because I think it implies a special interest group that looks after the quality of life for people. And if I can tell you right now from just going around the world in 2 months and seeing about 100 environmental groups worldwide, that if we're relying on these groups to save the planet for us, we're all in big trouble. And I don't mean that as a way of belittling the efforts of these groups, but what I'm saying is that we cannot have special interest groups looking after the environment. We all have to share this concern. We all have to be connected to this planet. And that's why I don't like the title myself, because I would hate to have someone sit back and think, well, Thom Henley's looking after the environment for me, so I don't need to worry about that. That is not the case.
Well, let's talk about your youth. Now, you're from Michigan, and you were going to university and you decided to throw that away, leave it, and you headed for Alaska.
Well, I didn't really decide to throw it away so much. I found university stimulating up to a point, but in another area it was not really fulfilling me, and I didn't find it as stimulating as other pursuits. And so I went up to Alaska just on a backpacking trip one summer and really fell in love with the place and actually never returned to Michigan.
So you weren't inspired by Jack London or Burning Daylight?
I was inspired by actually being in the place and seeing the real life characters that live there, you know, the trappers, the miners, the loggers, the native elders, and I really felt that's where my education began. And certainly in terms of the work I'm doing now with indigenous people, with international environmental issues, it's been a result of real life experiences and travel, more so than anything I've done academically.
Well, how did you survive in Alaska?
Quite simply, I took, what odd jobs I could find. I worked for a while as a commercial fisherman. I worked as a logger. I've worked in the farming communities there, worked firefighting, just whatever would come along. But I didn't need a lot of money to survive. I had built my own log cabin up there near Mount McKinley and had a small garden, and you can live off the land to some extent.
Were you starting to visit the tropics at that time? I know you sometimes to escape from the northern winter.
Yes, I actually facing my third Alaska winter and not looking forward to the length of it because they start in September and end sometime in early June. I decided to head to the Amazon. I kayaked down the headwaters from Pulkapa to Iquitos, and that was sort of the beginning of a number of winter adventures I would take to tropical areas. And so even during the 13 years that I was fighting to save South Moresby and the Queen Charlottes, very often I would take off maybe a month or two in the winter months, go to one of these tropical areas just to sort of recharge my batteries and get a little break from the issue, which I think is important to do. The most important thing it did for me is it put South Moresby into a global perspective.
How did you actually wind up at South Moresby now?
Okay,
strange the way you...
This goes back to this first trip when I left Alaska in the winter months, and I had a 17-foot collapsible kayak, and I decided to for lack of a vehicle, I decided to hitchhike with this kayak and my backpack all the way down to South America and kayak down the Amazon. And I got about as far as Honduras before I was just literally sick and tired of hitchhiking with this kayak. Turned around and headed back north, and when I got to the northwest coast, I started paddling up the coast and ended up going out to the Queen Charlotte Islands and paddling all the way through South Moresby and really falling in love with the place.
Did you actually paddle too?
I didn't cross from the mainland over. Some stories have got written up with me crossing, and I didn't make that crossing. I actually crossed from Prince Rupert over to Masset on a barge, and then paddled from there all the way down to the southern end of the Charlottes and up to the northern end. I tried to cross Dixon Entrance into southeast Alaska, got blown back by a storm, but that's when I first saw South Moresby and really fell in love with it. But I actually ended up going all the way back to Alaska before realizing that my heart was really in South Moresby, and then I immigrated to Canada in Whitehorse, Yukon, and went back to the Charlottes the following spring, and along with a Haida friend of mine, Gujau, formed the Islands Protection Society and initiated the South Moresby Park proposal.
What were you seeing when you first got back? Now, you formed that society, and I imagine it was something that really impressed you, that needed saving.
Well, the logging that was taking place in the area just adjacent to this proposed wilderness was the worst coastal logging I had seen anywhere in the world. You know, like they were just completely denuding islands, and all the topsoil was washing into the sea, you know, destroying the intertidal life. And I felt like surely this is not a way to be treating an area that, you know, in my mind was truly a World Heritage. And not a lot of biological studies had been done on the area at the time, although they did know that it had 1/4 of all the nesting seabirds on the Canadian Pacific, and they knew it had the highest concentration of sea lions and 5 species of whales, and but they didn't know things like it had the world's 2nd highest eagle nesting density, the largest concentration of peregrine falcons on
But
Earth.
somebody else did know that, didn't they?
We found that out through the course of 13 years and actually doing the research ourselves that the government had never done, and bringing in professionals to do these studies. And what happened is South Moresby emerged as an area that was truly globally significant, and UNESCO identified it as an area, in fact the only one in North America, that combined World Heritage, cultural, and natural history values.
On the falcon issue, weren't there a lot of falconers taking the falcons out?
Yeah, that was one of the issues we were dealing with too with the Islands Protection Society, is trying to protect these birds from both illegal poaching and the more legalized form of poaching, where the Fish and Wildlife Branch allows falconers to come in and take chicks.
Now, the park's been created, but isn't there fear that they're going to drill for oil offshore, right around the park?
Well, that's always been a fear. And, you know, the park is still a National Park Reserve. It's not officially a park yet. And there's still negotiations that need to be resolved with the Haida Nation. And it's something that we felt very strongly with right from the start, is that in no way should any protected status come over that area that would supersede the Haida's rights and traditional use of it. So that's still being worked out. And I think we need to really see a change in the National Parks Act here to incorporate indigenous people whose lands these are that are being made into national parks, because if they just become victims of parks, then we're never going to see the national park system completed in Canada, because all of the areas still in need of protection have overlying land claims. So they have to see a real partnership here where the indigenous people truly benefit from the creation of parks, because that hasn't been the case historically.
Can you describe your rediscovery program?
Okay, well, this is something I started up in 1978 with the Haida elders, and it was an attempt to deal with a real crisis situation on the Charlottes, where a lot of young people, both native and non-native, were having a lot of problems with alcohol and drugs, dropping out of school, just some of the normal problems we see with youth in our society at large. And they wanted to address that in a novel way, and we came up with this idea of rediscovery, where they would go out to a wilderness setting in an integrated camp, but sort of an extended family, where they wouldn't be just a specific age. So it'd be boys and girls, native and non-natives, working with the Haida elders and learning about the Haida culture and their relationship with the land and their relationship with each other. And so rediscovery has real 3 basic focuses: to discover more about the world within ourselves, the cultural worlds between us, and the natural world around us. And it's this kind of holistic approach that really was successful in helping a lot of young people, you know, come to terms with the problems they were facing. And while the program wasn't intended to meet the needs of any other communities, but the Queen Charlotte communities, it very quickly became a model that other communities wanted to follow. And now there's 15 rediscovery camps in Canada and the United States, and about 2 or 3 new ones developing every summer. So we've set up the Rediscovery International Foundation to assist communities in this development.
Thom, you were telling me that one of the South American leaders was asked a question by a Canadian as to how Canadians can protect the tropical rainforests.
Yeah, it was the Minister of the Environment for Brazil, Jose Luisenberger, and he said the number one thing Canadians could do to save the Amazon rainforest would be to protect your own forest in Canada. He says there's just no examples in the world where Brazil can turn to and say, well, Canada did it, why can't we? And I think it's very true. I think it's much easier for us to get involved in issues overseas than the ones right here in our own backyard, and these are the most critical. British Columbia alone probably has the worst examples of temperate rainforest destruction of any place on Earth. And we absolutely have to deal with these issues here. And I think at the same time we can't lose sight of what's happening overseas. You know, like when a culture like the Penan only has 2 or 3 years left to have any forest left in their 50,000-year culture perishes, we have to be as deeply concerned about that as we are what's happening right here in our own backyard. So I think it's really a case of thinking globally and locally and acting in both ways.
Fantastic, Thom. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.